This week's Seder Devariim, we find ourselves once again approaching a Shabbos Chazon, preparing ourselves to celebrate another Tisha B'Av, unfortunately. And indeed, the Gemara Yishamli tells us that Kol Dar She'eino Nivne B'Yamav, any generation in which we have not seen the ultimate awaited rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, then Ma'alin Olav Ke'ilu Hu Achrivo, then it's tantamount as if the generation in which we find ourselves alive and well, functioning so wonderfully. But without the Beis Hamikdash, it is as if we have indeed brought upon ourselves the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash itself. What is it that we are doing today that is keeping us distant from the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash? Particularly given the fact that we have emerged from the pandemic, perhaps there is a lesson to be learned from the words of Moshe Rabbeinu in the Seder of Devariim when he was rebuking Klal Yisrael, albeit in a veiled manner, and he says to them, "Vatikrvun Elai Kolchem," that all of you approach me as one, simultaneously at the same time. Atomru, saying to me, "Nishlecha anashim lefanenu," let us send men before us. V'yachbru lonis haaretz, let them scout out the land of Eretz Yisrael. V'yashiva osonu devaras haderech asher na'aleh b'av esa arim shenovo aleim. And Rashi tells us that in this moment of request, that meraglim, that scouts be sent to see the land of Israel that had been promised to them by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rashi says, "Vatikrvun elai kulchem," that all of you approached me, says Rashi, be'erbuvya, in a mass, in an incohesive mass, with a feeling of hefkerus. Ulahalanu omer, in contradistinction to later in the Sedra of Akev, when we are told regarding Matan Torah, Vatikrvun elai, not kolchem, that you approach me not once, rushing me as it were, but rather, Vatikrvun elai kol rashi shivtechem uzkenechem, that all of you approached me, all the heads of the shvatim, all the heads of the tribes, and the zkenechem, and all of the elders. And Rashi, says the Kli Yakar, is obviously telling us that in this contrast between the approach of Klal Yisrael to Moshe Rabbeinu for the sending of the spies, and the approach of Klal Yisrael following Matan Torah, the Aseres HaDibros, when Klal Yisrael asked that the rest of the Pirut HaDvarim, that the delineation of that which had been given on Har Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu, that Klal Yisrael heard, should only be shared with Moshe Rabbeinu, and then he would share it with them, because the Kolos of Barokim, the Eish, the fire, and the darkness was too overwhelming for Klal Yisrael. In the contrast between these two approaches, there was to be found an even greater sense of rebukement from Moshe Rabbeinu. What was it? Says the Kli Yakar, we see according to Rashi that when they approached asking for spies to be sent to Eretz Yisrael, they approached Vatikrvun elai kolchem in a mass, rushing Moshe Rabbeinu, elbowing their ways towards Moshe Rabbeinu. Says Rashi, for indeed, Vatikrvun elai kolchem be'erbuvya yeladim dochafinus asakenim uzkenim dochafinus aroshim. There was no order. There was no sense of respect for the elders. Yeladim dochafinus asakenim, the young were elbowing out the elders. And even some of the elders were elbowing out the leaders of Klal Yisrael. In contrast to Matan Torah, where indeed there it says, Vatikrvun elai, not kolchem, but rather Vatikrvun elai, when you approached me, kol rashi shivtechem v'ziknechem, all of Klal Yisrael, albeit with the proper order of the heads of the tribes and your elders, and then the younger people. Says the Kli Yakar, you know why they rushed Moshe Rabbeinu when they came to ask for spies to be sent to Eretz Yisrael, and they stayed behind, deferring with great reverence to their elders when it came to listening to the Pirut HaDvarim, to the delineation of the orders of the laws of Matan Torah. Says the Kli Yakar, because when it came to the delineation, to the explanations of all that had been given in Har Sinai, for the shiurim that Moshe Rabbeinu would be able to give based upon all that he would receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When it came to learning of the minutiae of Kabbalas HaTorah, and that required learning and sitting, the younger people said, that's for the older people, for the yeshishim, for the retirees, for the older people have time on their hands. They're not involved. They don't have the chemdas hamamon, the chemdas haaretz. They don't have the need or the desire or the requirement or the drive to get out there and amass a greater amount of money, more luxuries, more things that could they could avail themselves of to enjoy life. And therefore, when it came to Matan Torah, indeed the younger people said, let the older people go first. It's more for them. When we're retired, we'll make time, we'll have time to understand the greater details of Kabbalah Satorah. But when it came to inheriting the land, everybody rushed forward, elbowing the Zakanim, elbowing out of the way the Rashi Hashvatim, because they wanted to get there first, because they wanted to know what the land was like and how they would inherit it and how they would become bailim, owners over it, in order to enjoy its blessings, its physical and its monetary blessings. Says the Kli Yakar, Nebuch, we see from the Sefer Yeshayahu, when there's a description of all of that which has befallen Klal Yisrael, and remove the Beis Hamikdash from them, that we re-experience during these days of Bein HaMetzorim, the 3 weeks. We see that Yeshayahu was dumbfounded. He couldn't understand. He couldn't appreciate why indeed this was occurring to Klal Yisrael, until HaKadosh Baruch Hu effectively turned to him and he said to him, because Yirhavu Hanar B'Zakein, that indeed there was this lack of difference between the younger people and the older people because of the wants of the younger people, because of their priorities, in contrast to those of the elders. And says the Kli Yakar, Ve'od Yoda Natuya, that indeed even in my day and age, hundreds of years ago, when the Kli Yakar lived, we find that indeed it is still present. The sense of loss of priorities and the ensuing elbowing their way into the fray. Isn't it true that during the pandemic, in so many, a wonderful, sprung community, that the people who populated the shuls and the shtibluch, when there was social distancing, was not so much of the young people, but rather the elder people. The people who were warned by the physicians to social distance themselves and perhaps even to stay home because they were considered vulnerable given their age and given COVID-19. But it was the elder people who wanted to come and to be present on a Shabbos Kodesh or even during the week at the Minyanim, to hear a Kedusha, to hear a Baruch Hu, to hear Kriyas HaTorah, to hear the words of a Rav, no matter how shortened and curtailed and diminished they may have been during the COVID. Whereas the younger people stayed home. They weren't so concerned. They felt that they've got plenty of years to make Minyanim, plenty of years to have to sit through a shir, plenty of years to carve out the minutiae of the Torah that they were given by their parents. Whereas nowadays, when the pandemic has already concluded, and the very same shuls need to bring forth, and they need to regroup, and see that to it that the younger people re-enter their portals. So now kiddushes have started, kiddushes of every kind. And now indeed, kiddushes. For this, the elbows are beginning to exert themselves. Some of the younger people are coming back. For a kiddush, oy vavoy. When we find ourselves, kol dar she'eino nivne b'yamav, when we find ourselves getting ready to celebrate another Tisha B'Av, and to sit low, and to mourn for the Beis Hamikdash that has not as yet been restored to us, we have to remind ourselves the veiled rebuke by Moshe Rabbeinu between the Kirov, the coming close for the inheritance of the land of Israel, and Matan Torah, when the younger people were more than happy and more than willing to say, no, please, Askavid, you go first. You go first. We'll get there. We need to think about this. We need to rethink this over as we sit low this Tisha B'Av in order to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say to him, Hashivenu elecha v'noshuva, chadesh yameinu kikedem. Have a good Shabbos.